capital lawyering concentration here on the Mcgeorge campus, which is a concentration that focuses on legislative work, policy work, and government work. We have a number of students here that are in the concentration and also some students from our Masters of Public Policy and Master of Public Administration's program. And before we get started, I wanted to say thank you to the Capitol Center for co-sponsoring this event. We have Professor Leslie Jacobs in the back, who is the director of the Capitol Center, and project manager John Wainwright. And then also a big thank you to GASA and the Lambda Student Organization here on campus for their co-sponsorship, and to the many students and alum who have turned out tonight for this event. Brief introduction of Scott Wiener, and then we will get going with our questions and answers, and we're going to open the floor to questions and answers from the audience once we kind of have some time for a moderated conversation. So hoping that those of you out there will think of some good questions, and we'll go ahead and get started. Senator Scott Wiener represents San Francisco and the northern portion of San Mateo County in the California State Senate. He was elected in 2016, and he focuses extensively on housing, transportation, civil rights, criminal justice reform, clean energy, and alleviating poverty. He chairs the Senate Housing Committee and also chairs the California Legislative LGBTQ Caucus. Before being elected to the Senate, Senator Wiener served as a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors representing the district previously represented by Harvey Milk, and he also chaired the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. Prior to his experience in local government, Senator Wiener practiced law for 15 years, including nearly a decade as deputy city attorney for the city of San Francisco. He also served in a number of community leadership roles, including co-chair of the San Francisco LGBT Community Center and on the National Board of Directors of the Human Rights Campaign. Senator Wiener has lived in San Francisco's Castro neighborhood since 1997, and he is a graduate of Duke University and Harvard Law School, and he spent also a year in Chile on a Fulbright scholarship. So getting down to some of the questions that we've kind of talked about, the first one obviously is based on the topic. You have a tendency to find yourself in the middle of some of the most complex policy issues facing the legislature today. What drives you to kind of tackle those issues when some folks might shy away from some of the most complex and touchy issues that the state is facing?
Yeah, thank you for having me today. And thank you for taking the time to come out tonight. It's been a while since I've been a law student, but I know time is very valuable, so thank you. To me, you do public service to, try to make things better for people, and that means complicated, hard issues and being persistent and sometimes, when necessary, being controversial because you're pushing the envelope. And I have a great life in San Francisco and wonderful friends and could be doing a lot of things. And I'm doing this and spending part of my week not in my community because I want to make things better. And so, nibbling around the edges just isn't my style.
That makes sense. Talked a little bit about your neighborhood in San Francisco, and earlier we referenced representing the district formerly represented by Harvey Milk. Mm-hmm. How has that political legacy shaped your impact on public policy or the issues you choose to address?
I think it always looms large over me, and I know others, my predecessor in this role, Senator Mark Leno, and others. Harvey Milk represented a lot of things. He represented, the real entree of the LGBT community into very public life and elected service, and so that he was a real role model for many. He also, apart from who he was, the values that he represented, it was during a period when San Francisco was transitioning from sort of old school San Francisco, which was not very progressive, to a much more progressive version of the city, and Harvey was a key part of that. And so, representing the supervisorial district that he represented, and now continuing to represent our community in a different capacity, I think about it a lot. And there will never be another Harvey Milk. He was a unique persona in history, but what he stood for, it's really important for all of us who are part of the LGBT community and in elected office to know that we have to represent everyone, but we have to go to the mat for LGBT people, and that's something that was so important to Harvey and is so important to me.
And it's great to see that legacy living on. We talked a little bit about SB 50 in terms of it being one of the highest profile bills that was facing the legislature this year.
Mm-hmm.
Your decision to focus on zoning as the mechanism by which to try to address affordable housing. How did you come to that decision? And any plans for this legislation going forward?
Yeah, and to be clear, SB 50 was not a silver bullet. It wasn't the only thing that we needed to do. There are a number of things we needed to do, but zoning is one piece of it. And so you can't solve everything in one bill. And so in this bill, we decided to tackle the zoning issue, which is pretty foundational to housing. In my first year in the legislature in 2017, I authored a streamlining bill, Senate Bill 35, that accelerates housing approvals in cities that are not meeting their housing goals. And it was a bill I'm very proud of, and I think it's having real positive impacts today. But as we were going through that legislative process, I kept getting feedback over and over again. Well, people saying, well, it's great that you're streamlining, and streamlining is great. But if you don't address the restrictive zoning, it's going to have its limits. Of course, now once I do zoning work, then people say, no, but you have to do streamlining. So there's a lot of different things we need to do. But zoning is so foundational because it's really, that is the legal permissiveness or restriction on what is legal to build. So you can have a really fast approval process. You can have a lot of funding for affordable low-income housing. But if the zoning doesn't allow you to build anything other than a single-family home, then you're sort of out of luck. You can't build affordable housing when you have low-density zoning, single-family zoning. You can't, and it's a mathematical cap, right? We need millions of new homes in California. And if you have 75% of the land in California zoned only for single-family homes, that's a mathematical cap that we're not going to be able to reach our goals. And it's particularly pernicious to have this kind of zoning near where the jobs are and near where the public transportation is, because it just limits the number of people who can live there, pushes people further away, creates sprawl, gridlock, and so forth. So for a lot of reasons, zoning reform is essential. Zoning reform is also, it's a long-term strategy, right? Like it's not once, even if we perfected all zoning in California tomorrow, it's still, by the time a lot of parcels aren't available for development because they have homes on them. Maybe they'll be available in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, but it's about changing land use patterns over time.
Certainly. And bringing up affordable housing in California raises, obviously, the homelessness crisis. How do you feel like that piece fits into addressing homelessness in California? Do you feel like there are other pieces that you're looking at in terms of your legislative agenda?
Yeah, I think a lot of times, because homelessness has become so visible, it's always been with us, but it's so visible now, and not just visible in terms of the most obvious manifestations that we see on our streets, and particularly some of the mental health and addiction issues we see on our streets. But beyond that, since most homeless people don't have a mental health or addiction issue, people becoming more aware that there are a huge number of Californians living in cars, people living in shelters, people who are couch surfing, people who may not be homeless yet but are housing unstable, people who are low income, working and hanging on by their fingernails and at risk of becoming homeless. So people are seeing that. But unfortunately, what we are also seeing from a lot of, from some communities and from elected officials are, okay, we see this on our streets, and it's heartbreaking. So let's triage it. Let's make sure we have enough shelters. Let's make sure we have more mental health and addiction services. Let's triage it. And that's why I support them. I'm a strong supporter of shelters and navigation centers. We have to do much more for mental health and addiction. But what they sometimes people will bury their heads in the sand about is not linking that up to the housing shortage. And yes, a homeless person is not going to be able to afford a new apartment that's being built down the street. It's going to, we have a shortage. It's going to be expensive. But people have to recognize that the reason why homelessness has gotten so bad, it's not like people are more mentally ill now than they were 10 years ago. Mental health issues have been with us forever. Addiction has always, we've had some bad times and less bad times around addiction, but these have been problems for a long time. But what has changed is that housing has gotten so incredibly expensive that you have people who, so it used to be in San Francisco that if you were poor, let's say your only source of income was a disability check, maybe you had some mental health challenges or other health challenges, but you got a disability check. That was enough to get an SRO, a single room occupancy hotel. It wasn't fancy, but you at least were inside and had your own room. Now those SROs are renting for $1,500 a month in San Francisco. And we're seeing increasingly the people who are living there are retail workers, restaurant servers, and so forth, because they can't afford a traditional apartment. And then the people who would have been in those SROs or were in the past are now on the streets. One of the things that keeps me up at night is in the Bay Area, we have hundreds of thousands of low-wage workers who in the next few years very well may become homeless. And so we have to always remember that homelessness is not just about shelter. It's not just about supportive housing. It's not just about the triage of helping people who are in crisis on the streets now. It's about the dramatic shortage of housing that is pushing everyone down, where even there are upper middle class people who are struggling with, not in the same way, but they struggle with finding appropriate housing. Middle class people who are becoming all of a sudden on the edge, and then low income people who are being shoved into homelessness. And we have to always keep that in mind.
No, certainly not just treat the symptoms, but look for a cure. Yes. Another sort of segueing into another huge issue that's been in the news a great deal is the PG&E situation. What to do about the utility going forward, and you've proposed legislation to have the state take over PG&E. How did you choose that option as opposed to other options that have been proposed, and what do you think the viability of that is going forward?
Yeah, well, being a San Franciscan, which is PG&E's headquarters, and we've had my city's had a long history with PG&E, and and I used to give PG&E more of the benefit of the doubt, understanding that it had done problematic things over time, but always the optimist, thinking it could be turned around. And I eventually just more and more came to the realization that PG&E is never going to be able to turn it around. And speaking of triage, that company is just permanent triage, and so. Particularly once we saw with the wildfires and the results of decades of mismanagement, underinvestment, and then PG&E responding to that with mass blackouts for millions of people, very ham-handed approach, a sledgehammer instead of a scalpel. I came to the conclusion that this company is not going to be viable as an investor-owned utility. It's not going to serve the needs of California as an investor-owned utility. The whole reason we're in this mess is that for decades, PG&E was so focused on shareholder return and pleasing Wall Street that it was not investing in its system. And so making it a publicly owned utility, we have a lot of publicly owned utilities in California, including here in Sacramento. And publicly owned utilities are not perfect, and they can mess up just like anyone else. But I think at least we will take the shareholder piece out, the Wall Street piece out, and allow PG&E to focus exclusively on delivering safe, affordable, and reliable energy. Now, to be clear, this bill, the governor is going to drive, I think, what PG&E's future is. The governor has, mentioned state ownership before. I don't know that he'll go in that direction. We'll see. But I wanted to make sure that there was a formal seat at the table for the public ownership option.
Sure. No, that makes sense. It's obviously a complex issue, and a lot of folks have been weighing in on what they think is the way to go. And the governor's office will ultimately, hopefully, craft something that makes sense for all.
Another piece of legislation that you have recently authored that would be pertinent, I think, to our students in particular has to do with expanding the pool of potential jurors. What was your thinking behind that? What do you see as kind of the potential ramifications, and do you expect any pushback on that front?
Yeah, so I do a lot of work in around criminal justice reform, and we have a really broken system. California pioneered mass incarceration starting in the 70s, and even though we've reduced prison populations, we're still we're still overcrowded. We're still not delivering healthcare to people in prison the way we need to. And we're still spending way too much on the state prison system and underfunding UC and CSU and the safety net. So we need to do things differently. And in addition, the system has been very biased against communities of color. And you can see that just from interactions with the system and who's prosecuted, who's convicted, who's in prison. And one of the problems is that the jury pool doesn't reflect California. It's not a representative cross-section of the community because we draw our jury pools exclusively from voter registration rolls and from DMV rolls. And so if you're not registered to vote and you don't have a driver's license, you're not going to be called for jury duty. And so we have legislation to expand the jury pool to include anyone who files a tax return in California. And so it'll create a more representative jury pool. And we're working with the California Public Defenders Association on the bill. It's unclear yet what the pushback, how much pushback there will be. I suspect the biggest challenge is going to be costs because I've learned that any legislation, even if you don't think it's going to cost much, someone will put a big price tag on it. And I'm sure that the Franchise Tax Board will say it's going to cost a massive amount of money to create the database to do that. But we'll see.
Okay. No, that's, I was interested to read that, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out for sure. So you've been in the legislature since 2016. Mm-hmm. Which piece of your legislation that's now part of California law do you feel most proud of, if you had to pick?
I think one of the I think beautiful things, but also obligations of representing a district like mine, and there are only a few like these in the state, is you have, I think, an obligation to push the envelope on progressive change, but also to take on hard issues that other people think are icky or. But so I think I've developed an area in legislation working on issues relating to sex and drugs that some members are maybe willing to vote for but don't want to touch. And so I authored legislation that we were able to pass in 2017 to reform California's broken sex offender registry. And normally that would not be the answer to your question for most people. They want to talk about something that's more mom and apple pie and puppies and rainbows and unicorns, not sex offenders. But California's sex offender registry is a complete disaster. It is completely homophobic. It destroys lives, and it does not in any way enhance public safety. The registry was created in the 40s as a way to track people who are maybe sexual predators and have that tool for law enforcement. But what it ended up doing is 1 in 400 people in California are on the sex offender registry because it includes everything, not just the predators. It's people who were convicted for exposure because they were urinating in public, or gay men who were having sex in a car or in a park, people who did something when they were young that didn't really harm anyone. It was a violation of the law, but they're on it. Statutory rape, where you have an 18-year-old having sex with their 17-year-old partner. You have these situations where people end up on the registry, and it does two things. The registry is so bloated. It's like over 100,000 people, 130,000 people on the registry, that it's useless to law enforcement. Because if let's say you have a child that gets kidnapped, and so the police will say, let's pull up all the sex offenders within 20 miles, and it's like 800 people. There's nothing they can do with that. And so the registry really should be focused on people who present an actual risk, people who did something where you would be concerned they will actually reoffend. But the other piece of it is being on that registry, it destroys people's lives, especially because it's been public for the last 30 years. People can't get jobs, they become homeless, and therefore more likely to reoffend. And it has been a tool used against the LGBT community forever. And there are so many gay men in their 70s and 80s who have been on that registry for 30, 40, 50 years, even though they really didn't hurt anyone. And so we were able to pass legislation to tier the registry, to say that the people who are true threats, the predators, stay on for life. And there was no way to get off of it. It was we were one of only 4 states where everyone, no matter how serious or not serious your offense was, had to stay on for life. So we tiered it that the predators stay on for life, and then other offenses after 20 years or 10 years, you can petition to get off of the registry. And we were able to pass that. It took years. And we were able to do it, and Governor Brown was very supportive, and we had the support of law enforcement. It still barely passed because people sometimes don't want to vote for that kind of bill. But after it passed, and this is to me the most rewarding part of public service, is when there are real people whose lives have been improved because of your work. This was it really makes me emotional to think about it. I live in the Castro. A few weeks after the governor signed the bill, I was walking down Castro Street near my home, and this elderly man, a gay man, probably 80 years old, comes up to me and he said, I want to thank you. And he said, I never talk about this, but I'm on the sex offender registry since 1970 because, I was having sex in a park. And I now have a chance to get off the registry before I die. Wow. And it's just thinking about that, and that almost brought me to tears when he said that to me. And so this is real people whose lives are ravaged, not just by the registry, but by this entire criminal justice system that treats so many people unfairly. And we're just step by step trying to unravel that.
Certainly. I mean, that's a significant impact. Yes. As far as an inverse relationship between coverage or publicity, we've talked about tackling some of the most high profile issues. Is there a piece of legislation, when you reflect back on your record thus far, that maybe didn't receive a lot of coverage, but you feel like had a tremendous impact?
Yeah. So there are 2 that come to mind. One is on housing. Senate Bill 828 that I passed in 2018, that was very much under the radar. It was changing how our housing goals are set, the regional housing needs allocation, or RHNA. Every 8 years, every city in the state gets a goal for market rate housing, moderate, low income, and very low income. And we've been putting more and more teeth into that in terms of what happens when cities don't meet those goals. And so it's becoming a more effective tool. But the problem was that what happens is the state for each region says, here's your aggregate goal for your region. And those aggregate numbers were always too low. And then the region sub-allocates it. And you have, especially cities that are wealthier, that tend to get lower allocations, very politicized. So this legislation, in a very wonky way, put guardrails around that to ensure that the overall allocations were going to reflect actual future housing need, and to prevent that kind of politicization in terms of the sub-allocations to each individual city. So we passed it. There was some opposition from the cities, but no one could get riled up about it because it was so wonky. And that's a secret. If you want to do controversial bills, make them super wonky and nerdy and boring, and then people maybe don't get as riled. You can't do like an action alert on the bill. But the first region that went through its RHNA housing allocation process under this new regime, under this bill, was the Southern California Association of Governments, SCAG, which it's way too big. It's 19 million people. It's basically all of LA County, Ventura, Santa Barbara, the Inland Empire, Coachella Valley. It's like huge. And so they got their housing allocation was tripled to 1.3 million homes. And then when they did their sub-allocation, of course, what they wanted to do was shove all of the housing inland into the areas that aren't going to be as engaged or be able to fight. But ultimately, it was allocated. So, for example, the city of Beverly Hills, their housing allocation for the previous 8-year period was 3 units. That sounds like something from The Onion, but it was real. It's now 3,000.
Wow.
West Hollywood went from like 80 units to 3,000. Santa Monica went from 1,700 units to 9,600 units. So all these cities, these are cities where the housing should be,
Right.
Got dramatically higher RENA allocations, and now because of new teeth in state law, they're going to have to zone for all the additional housing, and they're going to have to build it. And so at the end of this year, the process starts for ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments, for the 9 county Bay Areas, and we're going to see much higher allocations too.
Sure.
So this bill definitely played a big role in that. And the other one, I don't remember the bill number. It was from my first year. Every year I author 1 or 2 bills around CalFresh, which is formerly known as food stamps, and CalWorks, formerly known as welfare.
Yes.
And trying to just, you never get like one word of press coverage. It's all just very quiet, like no attention paid to it. Trying to just improve the system. And so I did a bill for CalFresh about what we call accidental overissuances. Occasionally, a county, when they're issuing CalFresh benefits, they'll do there's no fraud, not fraudulent situations, but they'll accidentally give too much. So someone, let's say, is entitled to, I'm just making up a number, $150 a month in CalFresh benefits, and then for 6 months they get $170 instead. And they probably just, it's not a significant increase. So they probably just say, okay, my benefits went up. They didn't think twice about it. And so now after 6 months, it was determined that they had an overissuance. It was about $120. Under the law before this bill, the county was required to seek reimbursement and to go into collections. And for something that, first of all, it cost them more to collect than it was worth. And these are people who are not in a position to write, $120 or $400 check or whatever. But the counties had no discretion. So this legislation gave them discretion. If it was up to $250, the counties could administratively waive it. And again, it only applies if there was no fraud involved. They could administratively waive it. And then if it was higher than that, there was a process they could go through to write it down or to. And so we passed that bill, no fanfare, got signed. Governor Brown signed it at the end of 2017. And then about a year or a year and a half later, the Western Center on Law and Poverty, which was our sponsor of the bill, we were just talking to the staffer there who we work with, and more than $2 million in benefits just in the first few months of it being in effect had been written off. And so this was, and these are all small amounts. So the number of low-income Californians who had benefited in that way was huge. That was a good one as well.
Another concrete example of effect on people's lives directly. I'm going to ask just one more question, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions. But obviously, we've talked about a lot of interesting, complex, ongoing issues facing California. What's next on the horizon for you? Are you thinking about certain issues you'd like to pursue? Just tell us what we can expect to see. Yeah, so
we're still going on housing. I mean, SB 50 sadly failed on the Senate floor, but SB 50 and its predecessor, SB 827, over a 2+ year period, created enormous new political space around housing. And we've actually gotten some feedback from some local governments that were like, we know we opposed your bill, but we're sort of sad that we assumed it was going to be, lead to a good negotiated resolution and which is of course what I was saying to some of my colleagues, is give us a chance to continue this conversation, but it didn't work. But that bill 4 or 5 years ago would have been laughed out of the Capitol
Yes.
within 30 seconds of being introduced. And now we got it passed with bipartisan votes in 2 different committees. It came within a whisker of passing off the Senate
Yes.
floor. And so it opens the door. And so we're working with the Senate leadership now on a new version of strong production bill. I have a few other strong housing bills we're going to introduce soon, including one to allow churches and other charitable institutions to build affordable housing on their property. You have a lot of churches with big parking lots or other excess land. They want to build affordable housing. Cities won't let them do it, so we're gonna let them do it. I'm doing. I'm really passionate about mental health and addiction. So we're doing a big mental health parity bill this year to require insurance companies to cover all medically necessary mental health and addiction treatment, not just crisis care. It's going to be a huge fight with the insurance industry, but it's a righteous one. And then just today, it'll be in print tonight, we introduced a bill around meth. Meth, even though and we have a huge opioid emergency in this country, and it gets all the attention. Meth is a huge problem, and we actually have more meth overdose deaths than opioid deaths in California, and it is a major problem in San Francisco, but other places as well. And at least with opioids, there are medical treatments for it. There's none for meth, and so there is an approach called contingency management, which the VA uses, that you give people financial incentives to stay in a recovery program and to remain sober. It works. You give people gift card. Here's a Safeway gift card. Here's a Bed Bath and Beyond, card to get to whatever. And you give financial incentives, and it is hugely successful.
Interesting.
Over 60% of people become and stay sober for an extended period of time, and another 15 or 20% reduce their usage.
Sure.
And so it's arguably illegal under California law. It's considered a kickback. And so we want Medi-Cal to cover it, and we want to make sure that our community-based organizations are able to use it without violating the law. So that's another one.
Sure. So finding a way to incentivize that behavior in a very real way. That's not just an abstract goal. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I'm going to open it to the floor now for questions. John Wainwright, our project manager, has a mic. So if anyone wants to raise their hand and we can get started, we'd love to have some questions for the senator.
Okay. Good evening, Senator. I am a law student here, but I also work for an affordable housing developer. And so I wanted to thank you for SB 35. It's been very useful for us. There's 2 challenges when it comes to affordable housing. Well, there's many challenges, but 2 specifically that impact our business. One is we got to figure out how to build as many units as possible. But the other is trying to figure out how to do that within a reasonable cost. And one of the things in SB 35 was this provision that required prevailing wage and skilled and trained workforce provisions. And so in some instances, when we were streamlining, when we were trying to get around the conditional use permit process, we would actually be hit with additional costs that we didn't anticipate from the beginning. And that would preclude us from constructing certain projects. So I was wondering what your thinking behind that was.
Yeah, so and SB 35, I briefly referred to it earlier. It was the law we passed in 2017 that streamlines housing approvals in cities that don't meet their housing goals. And because about 2/3 of California cities don't meet their housing goals at any income level, so they're completely streamlined. 97% of California cities do not meet their below market rate goals. So SB 35 is producing mixed income projects, but basically its effect is that everywhere in California, if you're building low or very low income housing, you're streamlined. No CEQA, no conditional use, no discretionary reviews, no appeals, nothing. The city has 3 to 6 months to do objective design review, and then must ministerially issue the permit. It's really huge, and we actually are seeing the the biggest beneficiary has been 100% affordable projects. We have over 1,000 units in San Francisco alone that have been entitled under SB 35. We don't have global tracking on it. We just found out there's a developer who called us and said, "Oh, I have 2,000 affordable units under the entitlement process under SB 35." So we learn about it's really moving the dial, especially because for affordable projects, there's less financial wherewithal to withstand the 2 or 3 year process. And so if you can turn a 2 or 3 year process into a 3 to 6 month process, that means a lot. And it could mean, for cities that don't want it, it means that they have to allow it. So the bill, when you're taking away CEQA and discretionary approvals, that will always draw the attention of labor, of the building trades. They rely on those discretionary approvals to get wage agreements. And they're very open about that's what they do. My hope is that we can soon achieve an agreement between the building industry and the unions on wages, which will open the door to CEQA reform. So in order to get that bill, there's no way we would have ever been able to get that bill passed without labor protections in it. Now, there's prevailing wage and there's project labor agreements. Under SB 35, the project labor agreement requirement never applies to 100% affordable housing. It's only a prevailing wage. For market rate projects, it kicks in at like 50 or 75 units, depending on where you are. So smaller projects are not covered by that. Currently, the effect on affordable, I don't think is that significant, and correct me if I'm wrong, because if you have a penny of state funding in an affordable housing project, it's already required to use prevailing wage. And so that's why so many affordable projects are using SB 35, because they're already doing this. And so that provision doesn't affect them at all. It's a status quo for them. But there are clearly projects that would not have had to use prevailing wage that do now. And there are parts of the state where that doesn't pencil out as well. And so my hope is that we can just expand streamlining over time. But I think SB 35 was a pretty significant step forward in that direction.
Thank you, Senator, for your time. I just wanted to bring to attention the Senate Bill 145.
145?
Yes.
Yeah.
It came to my attention when I was up for assignment. I had to do a policy brief, and I stumbled upon it. And I'm so glad I did, because I didn't know that that was an issue for Californians, and especially affecting the younger generation. I think that that's an incredible bill that you put forward. I'm just curious, what's the status, and if it hasn't passed, what are the stumbling blocks in its way?
Yes, so Senate Bill 145, it's another sex offender registry bill. That registry, there's unending problems with it. So this particular problem is that the sex offender registry discriminates against LGBT young people. So basically, when you're talking about statutory rape, anytime in California the age of consent is 18, anytime you have someone under 18 involved, it's statutory rape. So this is about 14 to 17-year-olds, and no applicability under 14. So 14 to 17-year-olds who have sex with someone who is up to 10 years older. That's sort of the category that we're talking about. And so right now, if you fall within that bracket, 14 to 17-year-olds, someone up to 10 years older, if they're having vaginal intercourse, then it's statutory rape, but the judge has discretion to decide whether to put the person on the registry. So if it's an 18-year-old boyfriend, 18-year-old guy having vaginal intercourse with his 17-year-old girlfriend, there's a good chance the judge is not going to put that person on the registry. It's 24-year-old with 14-year-old, probably more likely to put the person on the registry. But the judge can look at the facts of the case and make that determination. If it's any other form of intercourse, oral or anal specifically, the judge must put the person on the registry, no discretion whatsoever. And the reason why this distinction exists, it's a relic. It's because the registry was created in the 40s when every form of intercourse other than vaginal intercourse was a felony. And so we have a situation where, again, that 18-year-old having intercourse with a 17-year-old girlfriend, he doesn't have to go on. but the 18-year-old having intercourse with his 17-year-old boyfriend must go on. And it's also completely bizarre that for that 18-year-old boy with his 17-year-old girlfriend, if she performs oral sex on him, he must go on the registry. But if they have vaginal sex, he doesn't have to go. The judge can decide to keep him off. So it treats vaginal intercourse as somehow less serious. Oral sex is somehow just egregiously worse than vaginal intercourse. It leads to bizarre results. And the California Supreme Court in about 15 years ago struck down this distinction and said this is a violation of equal protection. There's no rational basis to have this distinction. And then about 6 years ago, to its eternal shame, the California Supreme Court reversed itself and it said there is a rational basis because with vaginal intercourse can result in pregnancy and we don't want to stigmatize the father. So that was their incoherent rationale. And so there was an effort 5 years ago to reverse that decision by saying all of this entire age bracket, if there was no coercion involved, if it was consensual, then it is discretion of the court. And so we have that bill again. It was delayed last year, and we're hoping to get it passed this year. And again, law enforcement supports the bill. And by the way, the length of that explanation will tell you why we can never win the public relations battle on it, because I get attacked regularly by the right wing for enabling pedophilia. They call me they say I must be a pedophile since I'm doing this bill. So it gets really ugly.
Hey, thank you for doing this. I got two questions about land use. So when you're designing a land use bill, how do you balance needs, housing needs, individual liberties in the democratic process, right? If your land use bills are pulling away decision making from local decision makers to state decision makers, how do you balance all these competing needs? And then my last question is, if you could change anything about the land use regulatory structure, you just had a magic pen, you could do whatever, what would you do?
Well, in the first question, in terms of democracy, as I like to remind people that the California legislature and the governor are elected by the exact same people who elect local governments, right? They're just electing at a different level. So we're all, elected. But in terms of one thing I do want to point out, I'm a former local elected official, and I believe in local government. I believe in local decision making. I think city council member. I was a full time because San Francisco is a big city, and so I had a salary that I could live on and staff and all that. The vast majority of city council members and even mayors in California either don't draw a salary, draw a de minimis salary, have no staff, but they still get yelled at in the supermarket by people who are mad about everything. So I have enormous respect for local elected officials. These are people who they're just committed to their communities. The local land use process in California, and I've experienced this as a neighborhood association president, I've experienced it as an elected official, I've watched it. It is usually not a democratic process. It's a very self-selecting process where the vast majority of people have no idea it's happening. For the most part, not always, for the most part, when you look at who's going to neighborhood association meetings that are evaluating projects, who's showing up at planning commission hearings, not young people, not people of color, it's not renters. Sometimes places like San Francisco, you're more likely to draw a broader cross-section, but not always. And in many, many, many cities in the state, you're certainly not drawing that broader cross-section. And especially younger people who are starting out their lives and their careers and maybe starting a family and just trying to, figure out where they are in life. They're not joining their neighborhood association. They're not spending 6 hours at the planning commission. And so we have a system that is sort of designed to empower the people who are a minority. And we know that SB 50, as much as, I had colleagues who were like, everyone in my district hates your bill. And I knew intuitively that's wrong. You're just hearing from the people who are angry about it. Most people don't show up at senator and assembly member town halls. When you look at the polling, in San Francisco, SB 50 was polled repeatedly. It polls at 75%. It was polled 3 times last year statewide. It polled between 61 and 61%. Support in every region, every demographic. Renters supported more than homeowners, but homeowners supported it. People of color supported more than white people, but white people still supported it. Younger more than older, but older still supported it. And yet, if you just were basing it on who's participating in the democracy of land use, you would think everyone hated it. And so that's why I'm thrilled that the YIMBY movement has started, because that brings a lot more young people in particular. It's not perfect, but it brings a ton of young people into the process, and that's a sea change. But I also think that what we're doing at the state level, honestly, and not ending local control, but taking away some local control, is actually, I think, more democratic, because it's creating a more rational system that's more based on very transparent standards, not on who happens to be yelling the loudest at midnight at the planning commission, so the commissioners just give in and say, we're going to chop off the top story of this building. That's what happens. I've seen it with my own eyes. And so I think we're actually making it in some ways more democratic. If I could wave my magic wand, we would, put SB 50 into effect. We would have multi-unit development around, in all the places where it should be. We would have a very strict shot clock that, depending on the size, that there would be very clear, your projects have to be approved depending on the size, whether it's 3 or 6 or 9 months, or maybe a year for the, biggest projects. We would have some reforms to Prop 13 in our tax system, because right now cities have a huge financial incentive not to allow housing, because they make a lot more. Cities are cash strapped for basic services, and commercial development is much more lucrative for a city budget than residential. We would have tax, and it might not, even without changing Prop 13, you can have better regional sharing of sales tax, for example, and reward cities that allow more housing to create a different incentive. We would bring back a better form of redevelopment. Redevelopment was the most powerful tool for cities to fund affordable housing and supportive infrastructure. It was taken away. It was ended in 2011 because there were abuses, and Governor Brown wanted it gone, and he sort of forced the legislature to do that, and they didn't replace it with anything. And that has really hamstrung the ability of cities to fund affordable housing. So, those are a few things that we would have, definitely, strong protections for renters, because, we passed great legislation last year to put a statewide rent cap, just cause protections in place, and that is protecting millions of renters. But we need better enforcement, for example. So we have a lot of work to do to keep people stable in the housing that they have.
Senator, thank you for your time tonight. I recently moved here from Stockton, where Mayor Tubbs received national recognition for the Universal Basic Income Program. I'm curious on your thoughts, calling on you for pushing the envelope, if that has any room in the housing crisis as a potential solution for a state or for a national program.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Mayor Tubbs, who is also a supporter of SB 50. So universal basic income is something I'm very open to. I've seen a lot of arguments all over that issue, and I'll be honest, I have not dug deeply enough to have a really firm position on it. I think I'm glad that it's part of the conversation. I think it could definitely have a place in, especially with all the transitions going on in our economy. I'm glad that Andrew Yang also, I think elevated it quite a bit. So it's something I'm open to, and I have a positive feeling about, but I'll just be honest that I've never really dug in to that particular issue deep enough. I have limited brain space, and sometimes you have to pick and choose the things that you drill down deep on.
Okay, well, I think we will allow some time for reception. I'm hoping Senator Wiener might stay around for a couple minutes if students have kind of one-on-one questions or issues they'd like to raise. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you again, Senator Wiener. This has been fantastic.
Thank you.